Instead of me introducing you, why don't you guys introduce yourself, actually? We'll just go down here, just make it 10 seconds, not those 5-minute introductions.
10 seconds,
Okay.
Who are you and who do you write for?
Mitch Wagner. I'm editor, Enterprise Cloud for Light Reading. Our publication has historically and mainly is still for service providers, the AT&Ts, Verizons, and Cablevisions of the world. However, we are moving into the enterprise, other businesses, retail, manufacturing, and so on, with a particular cloud focus, and I am heading up the editorial for that.
Okay.
25 seconds.
All right, then. I'm Craig Matsumoto. I'm managing editor with SDX Central. We're writing for the enterprises and service providers that are affected by all of this software-based disruption. SDN, NFV, containers, the transition to the cloud, all that stuff.
I'm Alex Williams, founder, editor-in-chief of the New Stack. We write for developers, software engineers, operators, and anyone who likes pancakes.
It's really your business model is pancakes.
Basically,
right?
it's like, I was saying, like, we're going to start developing, like, parallel pancake processing
Kind of the international
technologies.
house of
That's,
virtualization.
we're going to develop a whole pancake ecosystem.
Yes.
Are they open source pancakes?
Open core.
That works. That works. All right. We're supposed to talk about open source.
I want to talk about pancakes.
I want to eat pancakes.
They're one and the same,
All right.
No?
Media people do not like to answer questions. They like to ask questions.
It's exactly
Get that.
right.
What do you mean by that? Oh, sorry.
I had a plan for this panel.
I think maybe what you meant to ask was what do we find confusing about
that is
open
absolutely
source?
what what I was
Have
gonna ask.
difficulty explaining to the readers. Well, why don't you answer that question, Mitch? Sure, I'll go right ahead. I think the thing that I deal with when I'm writing about open source for our readers, I think of our readers as people who are at the intersection of technology and business. These are business-aware technology professionals who are, or technology-aware business professionals. This is why I'm at this conference but wearing a suit, for instance. Guys, dress up. We're not savages.
I am dressed. I've got socks.
What I end up having to deal with is that a lot of the stories that I get are focused on either the technology itself or focused on developments that are primarily of interest to the open source community rather than the outside community. So my job is to basically translate that to a wider audience. And you talk about this being confusion, that implies it's a problem. It's not a problem, it's my job. The lack of scalability in certain systems is not a problem for software developers. It's your job to fix that problem, and you're happy with it.
Is that how you approach it, Craig?
Oh, yeah. Confusion is our business model, right? If everybody understood what was going on, we wouldn't have jobs.
We're looking for seed funding, by the way.
For me, open source, so I've covered regular open source. I actually covered Linux in the 90s when you had to explain what it was, how anybody could survive giving things away for free, that kind of thing. But covering open source lately, I've come at it from the networking side, right? Because I covered switches and routers. From that, got an SDN and into this whole open source thing. So open source is new to networking, and I think there is a lot of confusion there for it because they're accustomed to standards. They're accustomed to very rigid and controlled ways of deciding what direction the whole industry is going to go into next. Whereas open source is anybody does anything they want, and the best ideas survive. And I think there's still a transition period, especially on the telecom side, a transition period going on where they're trying to figure out just how they're going to end up using this open source stuff and how they're going to cope with the chaos that's out there.
How do you help them figure that out?
So far, I'm not sure I do. Well, so far what we do is we track and catalog the different projects that are coming up. So this is all still in formation, right? There are still a lot of the networking open source projects are still in their very early stages, and new ones are continuing to come up. The treadmill hasn't stopped yet. So we actually have been talking, at some point we're going to have to list or catalog all of these and try to help people sort out what the differences are between what they're trying to accomplish, because they don't all have the same objectives.
Sure.
I agree with you that our job is to explain things and to really do analysis, but so often what we see in the press, maybe not from this group up here, but generally is just news coverage, right? It's just the latest thing that's happening.
Yeah.
And I think when you start writing about open source ecosystems, that becomes increasingly difficult to do, because you can't just write about open source ecosystems, what the latest, greatest thing is from an open source organization, be it a foundation or whatever it is. I think more so now, it's trying to understand how these open source organizations actually work. You know, how are they managed? Like what is that collaborative process? You know, what are these, you know, I mean, just, of course, you know, not to be dramatic though, I don't mind being dramatic. I mean, there's forces of good and evil at play, right? You know, what are those forces of good and evil? I mean, that's when it gets fun. That's when you can start actually writing about this and like start getting into the depths of the, you know, of what these ecosystems are all about.
When you say good and evil, what are you actually talking about?
Well, I mean, you know, that's a subjective thing, you know. That's when we can start to have a lot of fun about the different forces that are at play, right? You know, there's lots of different forces at play. Some people would say the cloud services providers are the greatest threat to open source because they basically control the infrastructure and so many different types of apps run on them. I mean, if you look at the whole kind of like cloud credit economy that startups work on, there's a lot of companies out there that are just really reliant on these big providers because they're like essentially locked in, right? So you start to see the emergence of these open source communities and how they're represented, and you know, and how they're in contrast to these very big infrastructure as a service providers.
Yeah, I guess there are politics at play.
There's a lot of politics at play.
Because that's one of the differences that I liked at first, covering these open source projects compared with covering standards, because standards, it's a very familiar process and it's highly political. Right?
Yes, yes. And actually, if you look at like what's happening in the foundation world, right? You know,
Yeah.
and I mean, especially, it's like, you know, I talking to someone who I really respect, who is a well-known person in this community, who talks about how we're starting to see really the emergence of game theory, right? So when you certainly have like foundations at play, and you have very large members at play, and there's, you know, the board is dominated by the members, and maybe the members control the trademark, and then the trademark then is, you know, then if you're going to start developing products kind of in the name of the trademark, how do you do that? There's all kinds of factors that start to come into play.
Yeah, there's the question of one of the most interesting major trends that I see is, I think, you know, we've gotten past the point now where business was suspicious that open source was communism. Everybody understands that open source can be put to work for business. Well, the companies that still think that now are basically on their way to, you know, bankruptcy. Start looking at their office furniture.
Well, then that would probably be the
buy.
majority of the networking companies that you cover, wouldn't it be?
I think, you know what? I think a lot of them, they're embracing open source, but they see it as a way to get free in R&D. And whether...
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft in the 90s had that expression, embrace and extend. You know, and this was basically a way of killing open source, is what it came down to, and killing standards.
Open source or smothering it. You know,
Yeah.
You know, saying, hey, this is open source, but like you were saying, you have someone controlling the project from behind the scenes, and they get to dictate where it goes.
Yeah, a lot of the really big companies now understand that open source is something they can harness to help their business. But then the big question comes, how? I loved the AT&T presentation yesterday, where he was talking about how they had to come up with basically an internal definition of their own open source for their own use. It's kind of like, we all know what open source is, or do we? And I can't remember exactly what all the points were, but one of them was you don't pay for the license. The other one is the source code is available to you. All of these things seem obvious, but you only learn it after you've been burned by it.
And I mean, if you look at our economy now, software is at the center of business,
Yeah.
and open source is increasingly at the center of software, and that means a real shift in how actually organizations will have to think about how they're managed and how they're run. So, for example, if I'm a vice president of engineering and I really do want to build out scaled out applications for whatever service, you know, I have, I have to start thinking about open source in a much different way. I have to think about contributing to those communities and trying different types of open source technologies. So now I have to think, well, who am I hiring? Who's on my team? What roles do they play? And there's all kinds of ways to think about that.
Yeah, and
That's what I find fascinating.
Yeah. One of the things that I find fascinating is how do you manage an open source project when you don't have that hierarchy of somebody at the top who's responsible for how much everybody below him gets paid?
Right.
It's creating challenges for our job too, though, because at times we don't know who to talk to.
Exactly.
When it comes to these projects, right?
Well, that's really led us into an interesting direction to start trying to analyze these open source communities. And I tell you, it is not easy. It really isn't. I mean, just trying to track who the people are inside these communities and what who they work for and what they do. I mean, there's some top-level information you can get from GitHub, but to really start digging into it, you have to start connecting the dots. You have to start almost like becoming. We have to actually we're starting to develop the tools ourselves to try to just get an understanding of it.
Are you in the IRC channels too?
I'm not even going to go there. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole situation that arises. I came up with this metaphor the other day. It's kind of like when I was a kid, I lived in a neighborhood where everybody was either Jewish or Catholic. Now, the thing about the Catholic Church is it's one entity, and it has an official point of view. And the thing about Judaism is it's just kind of a widespread revision without a hierarchy. And there's a standard joke among Jews that if 10 Jews move into a town, they set up 11 synagogues. Because they can't even, they all argue with each other, and one guy is arguing with himself or something. Commercial technology companies are like the Catholic Church. There's a hierarchy. There's an official point of view. You can go to a PR person. You can go to the CEO. You can find out what's going on. Who speaks for OpenStack? Anyone? Show of hands? I did an article a couple of weeks ago where I talked to the executive director, and he said one thing, and I talked to one of the project leads, and he said something else. I just quoted them both.
And you would think the proliferation of all these foundations would make that easier. But
I laugh a hollow laugh.
And you talk to two different members, and they even have different goals from the foundation usually when you talk to them, right? They want something completely different out of these projects. But for those people in the audience who maybe run an open source project, what can they do to make our lives easier?
What can they do to make our lives easier?
Because that's what we want. We're lazy at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably our job to find out from them really what these organizations are all about, and understanding, from them, if it's a foundation, who are the members, what are their roles, who's on the board. I think those are all the kind of questions that we need to be understanding of. I think it's more about just what is the direction of that organization and what is its role. But it's a funny thing. I mean, you don't know, and the other thing is, do you guys cover open source organizations? You do, don't you? But how do you view it in terms of the companies that you cover? There's a funny kind of a mix there.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
And there's not that much interest in it sometimes from the readers as well.
Yeah, the way I've been covering it is sort of an offshoot of the way we cover companies, because the group, in the network functions virtualization world, NFV, there are a couple of open source organizations. So because the companies we write about are doing a lot of work for these organizations, we end up writing about the organization. So in a way, it's an offshoot of the company coverage. So I haven't gotten as deeply into the mechanics of how the groups work. Who's making the organizational decisions. I wonder, so I agree with you. I think it would be good to have a clear statement of objectives, one person to talk to, if they want to assign that, but I wonder if there's value in the chaos of open source.
Yeah, there is.
That is the essence. The chaos is the value.
So why should they care about
Yeah.
putting together an organized front for us when they could actually just go get things done, maybe.
Or not get things done.
Or not get things done,
To your point, to your question, I think it's very interesting to see how the open source organizations have emerged to play a lot of the role that the vendors have played historically.
Right.
The OpenStack Foundation is kind of sort of an equivalent of VMware or whatever. sort of.
You're getting some chuckles from the audience.
I know, but still, you know, in the sense that you're producing platform software in the OpenStack Foundation, they produce platform software. There is obviously, when VMware talks about OpenStack, they talk about it in the way that companies talk about competitive technology that they feel required to embrace.
Yeah.
VMware's marketing pitch is, we absolutely believe OpenStack is the future, but not today. And I say, well done, marketing person. You've phrased that very well.
You know, it's interesting because I think the open source ecosystems are kind of on the frontier of a new generation for how to think about open source and how it should apply. And I think the foundations are reflective of that. I think OpenStack is probably reflective of that to some extent. You know, and I think for us as journalists, we're right on the frontier of this to understand how we actually do cover it. And I think just as journalists, often what we do is we follow the threads, right? You know, what are the threads like that you should be following? So for example, in the last 2 weeks, there was a very well-known kind of discussion online between Kelsey Hightower of Google and Solomon Hykes of Docker, and they were debating about the role of OCI and the role of the runtime in the OCI. And if you're not familiar with OCI, it's the Open Container Initiative, and it hasn't yet gotten to 1.0. And you know, and originally Docker had been really fully behind, OCI, but now there's some questions about that. That directly affects a lot of people. That has there's a lot of technologists now who are like thinking, well, what's going to happen now? And that's when you can start covering, that's when we can start following the threads and say, well, what's actually happening in OCI now? Where is it right now? What are those discussions right now to provide some analysis and clarity around the situation?
For me, that's a difficult story to make a decision on because it's starting to seem to me a little bit hard to draw a direct line from what's going on in OCI between Google and Docker all the way over here to the guy at the retail company who wants to implement a mobile app for his customers and needs a cloud infrastructure to run it.
Well, I don't know if there is that corollary.
Yeah.
I think mostly it's just that's the story right now. The story right now is about that thread that's emerging. But I think, and then that'll then, I think then relates to then what's actually happening in OCI, what's actually happening in, in other kind of organizations that are associated with OCI, such as, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
Yeah,
there's a lot here. There's a big market there that's looking at these types of issues.
The hardest question I ever get asked by people in the industry who aren't journalists, by friends and family who aren't even in technology, is how do you decide what to write about? And I just realized sitting here right now, the hard question for me is deciding what not to write about. There's so much going on. There's part of me right now going, that OCI story, I gotta look into that. I gotta look into the OCI story and make sure it's really not a story. And it's like,
Make sure it's really not.
So
There's definitely a story.
Eventually you have to learn which stories to walk away from, not which stories to write.
If it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah, can we get a knife fight here, by the way, when we get the camera? And I mean an actual knife fight.
That would be a story.
The good old days.
Well, how do you decide what to cover then, or not to cover? What makes, when it comes to open source specifically?
In some cases it's just whatever I like, whatever tickles a portion of my brain. Because I figure if I'm interested in it, somebody else must be.
Yeah.
On the networking side, there's still, like I said, a lot of these groups are still in formation. So there's still a lot of open question as to how much they'll get accomplished and what direction things will go into. Groups like Open Daylight seem to have gotten a lot done. That's been kind of fun following them. Groups like OPNFV, there are still a lot of people who aren't clear on their mission. Like OPNFV is clear on its mission. There are a lot of people who misunderstand it. They think OPNFV is a project to put together an NFV implementation for a telecom network using open source pieces. They're going to come up with a reference design. There's people who still think they're going to get a shrink-wrapped product out of OPNFV. So it's still kind of, there's a lot of ambiguity to clear up. How far along they've gotten, I'm not sure, but just the progress of these things for me has been a story.
Our focus is on application development and management at scale. So we're looking for those kinds of stories. Now, there's a lot of stories there, right? So, we started about 2 years ago, and that's when Docker was starting to come into, starting to gain a lot more acceptance and a lot more interest in it. And so we've been following that Docker story and that container story, and we're going to continue to write about it. But now what we're starting to see is, I think Docker and container ecosystem will always be core to our coverage, but we're starting to look at kind of like, okay, so where are things going now? And we're starting to see that with like, for us, the mega theme obviously is automation, right? But now we're starting to see more discussions about machine learning, more discussions about AI in operations and actually in the application development and management lifecycle. So we're looking for those stories, and so that helps us focus to some extent.
Is there still a lot of, I notice a lot of the stories I cover when it comes to open source are linked to successful companies already or have some kind of backing. Is there still a space for covering just that 1-2 person project that's really cool? Is there even room for that left?
I love doing that.
Yeah.
It's not always a hit with readers, but I enjoy those stories. Yeah.
And we have a policy actually that we will gladly, if you're like leading a 1 or 2 person open source community, you've started an open source community and and it's on GitHub and you want to write about it, you want people to know about it, we'll gladly accept those contributed pieces.
All right.
And, in terms of what to cover, what not to cover, one of the things that's become a problem for me in networking, I came from a hardware world, right? We covered things like core routers. It's a product that will take you 4 years to build. And when it comes out with just all these features and this whole backstory about how you did the chip and all that. In open source software, things happen incrementally. So you have the 12.1 release followed by the 12.1.1 release, and it's, so in terms of the routine product coverage, it's gotten a little harder. That you have to filter out a lot more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the challenges for the media these days, I think is a similar challenge that analyst organizations face, is that traditionally there'd be people who covered networking, there are people who covered storage, there'd be people who covered so it was very kind of siloed. And you see that in the analyst organizations. I've had conversations with people from Gartner about this and how they've had to change their names for what they discuss, and they kind of think about how they group their different analysts accordingly. I think that's a challenge that we face now, is because, I mean, if you think about it, it was well said to us by someone recently who said, if you really think about it, there's 2 things that are really happening right now. You have a major identity issue, right, with people, and then the constructs are changing dramatically, right? So like the identity issue comes when like a networking person is like, that developer's doing the networking over there? What is going on here? That is not the way it has always been. Yeah. So now there's an identity issue there, right? Mm-hmm. And the construct issues become then like, what does actually a firewall mean anymore, right? What is now, if you think about the terminology it's used by, for instance, Kubernetes platforms like pods, like what the heck's a pod, So those are the kind of dynamics that I think make for the coverage that help us kind of understand like, what is actually happening in this universe right now, and how do we cover things, and how do we help people understand things? Yeah,
and then you have the issue of like just network lagging behind other resources for the cloud. So the classic thing that we hear a lot is, you can, if a developer needs compute, they provision it like that. If they need storage, they provision it like that. If they need networking, you send an email to a guy who does a thing in a command line and maybe actually makes physical changes to the network infrastructure. Yeah. So that's what the networking guys are scrambling to catch up, and that's where a lot of NFV comes from.
Yeah.
All right, I think they're going to kick us off the stage in a moment here. We could keep talking about this for another half hour, I know, because we've done that before.
But no one would listen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.